And I believe we're jumping right in. No more countdown, no more counting down for the live stream to begin, 10 or 20 seconds, straight into the video. People will catch up as they catch up. Good to see everyone here. Those of you who are already in the chat, looking to catch up with the people who'll be joining later, as well as those watching on the recording. Welcome, everyone. This is For the Love of Comics with another Sunday live stream. Just making sure that everything over here is working the way it's supposed to. I always ask people right at the top of the stream to let me know if the audio is coming across all right, if the video is coming across all right, if all of that stuff is fine, as well as to let me know in the chat where they're joining from. So those of you already here, if you feel like it, please let me know where you're joining this live stream from. I just shut down all my windows in an attempt to mute the video I was playing. So I'm going to make sure that I can see what's going on as well. So I'll be catching up with all of you in just a second. I'm almost there. You can see that I'm rusty with this because it has been a while since my last live stream. I think, what was my last live stream? The one on this channel, the last one that I did was The Art of Mouse Guard, in which I looked at a number of Mouse Guard stuff as well as some original art or one piece of original art. But I have been online since then. I've just been on other people's channels, on Highland G's channel, over on Near Mint Condition and the Comic Binge, and I had a conversation. And there's a couple of interesting collaborations coming up that I'll talk about later on in this live stream as more people join. Good to see you, Comics Fan. Audio sounds good. Dialing in from Finland. Good to have you over here. For those of you who are on the chat, or those of you who are watching live, as well as those of you who are watching a recording and looking at the live chat transcript, make sure you are on live chat instead of top chat. This is just something to make sure that we're not missing any of the chats, because I don't know what the criterion is for selecting between the chats to determine the top chat, but live chat shows you all of the chat. So good to have everyone over here. Welcome to another For the Love of Comics Sunday live stream. I hope everyone's been keeping well. And this is, I think, my first video on this channel in the year 2026. So Happy New Year, even though it's a week into February at this point of time. This is going to be one of my recent reads and new acquisitions videos, although not so much with the new acquisitions except for one honorable mention. Today, I do want to talk about a handful of books that I have actually gotten around to reading, even though some of these are books that I read a little while ago and I've been meaning to talk about in some way, and I just haven't had the opportunity. And some of these are recent, very recent reads, and some of these are from a couple of weeks ago. Nothing older than, I would say, a couple of months is probably the oldest book that I can look over here. So fairly recent reads. And I don't think this is going to be one of those long live streams that we sometimes have a history of on this channel, because, as I said, this is only a small handful of titles. But I did want to also get a sense of what people think of these titles. So those of you in the audience who have read one or more than one of this, and over the live chat, but also in the comments for the recording. If people watch this later, make sure you leave your opinions in the comments, because I always like going through them and figuring out what my next video should deal with, because it's a sort of conversation, the way I look at it. And a number of books over here, in fact, I've mentioned, well, now that I say it, I don't know, but at least one book I've mentioned before when I acquired it. It was an acquisition at the time, and a lot of people had a lot to say. So I had an opinion of it even before I started reading it, which is interesting because obviously most of these books, if not all of them, come from some form of recommendation or the other. Either they are recommendations from fellow YouTubers, people who make videos and tell me, among other people, what they've read recently and what they've enjoyed. It may be from viewers who leave these in comments, but also get in touch with me over Instagram or DMs and email, which I love getting, and people recommending books to me. And then there are obviously the general sort of discussion around things that one absorbs either from online discussions or conversations within groups one is a member of. And it's always interesting to me to figure out, where did I first hear about something, or how many times have I heard something coming up? And some of these books are discovered through, or most of these books are discovered through that sort of idea of recommendation. However, there are a couple of other books that I was just either outright on the lookout for, was waiting for, or I'd heard about as a publication announcement. And that's one other way that I have, looking forward to the next works or works that I haven't yet gotten to by favorite creators. And then there's always that one slim group of titles that you pick up just out of serendipity. Maybe it's a sale like the one that took place on Amazon some time ago, and I had a live stream about all the books that we'd picked up over there. And sometimes it's a question of just running across something in a bookstore that looks interesting or catches your eye. Similarly, there might be presents or gifts that someone sends to you or gives to you that you're not that familiar with. So today, I think, even though we have a relatively smaller selection of comics, I think we hit one of those boxes. We check one of those boxes in all of them. There's one of each kind, I think, of the categories that I've talked about. So good to see you here, Mr. Haz. How's it going? We've got Sai Kulkarni Mukherjee from West Bengal, India. Thanks for joining in. And great, we've got a dozen people or so watching right now. I'm sure more people will join in and out. If you have any questions for me, do put them into the chat and I'll address them as I go through these comics and as I go through these books over here. But for now, I'll take a quick sip of water and jump into our first books. Hello, Mad Bomber. All right, so the very first book, and the one that I would say is, like all of these, as I mentioned in my note, all of these are recent reads that I've enjoyed. There might be a couple of other recent reads that aren't part of this list, either because I've talked about them recently somewhere else. For example, I mentioned there was a conversation with the Comic Binge about The Immortal Hulk, which is a relatively recent read for me. And then there is another recent read that is ongoing that I'll get to in a little while. That's for an upcoming video. So those are the ones that I've talked about on Highland G's channel, or the ones I've talked about with the Comic Binge or on Near Mint Condition. I'm not mentioning those over here because I've already talked about them. And a couple of ones that are ones I'm looking forward to talking about, I'm not talking about them. So there is that. And then there are some that I read that I didn't particularly enjoy, or I didn't really make much headway with. And in the usual fashion for this channel, I'm sort of leaving that out as well, just because I'd rather focus on the things that really impressed me, or at least impressed me a little bit. But I'm going to start at the highest note with my favorite of the reads of recent times. In fact, maybe one of my favorite comics of the last few years in some ways. This is Joe Sacco's The Once and Future Riot. This is published by Metropolitan Books, Henry Holt and Company, and this is not, I don't think this is a publisher whose work I am that familiar with. I am obviously very familiar with the works of Joe Sacco. In fact, I don't know if I'd mentioned it on this channel before, like on a live stream, but I got the opportunity to meet Joe Sacco when he was in India a couple of years ago, and attended a talk and a Q&A with him. Got to meet him after that on a couple of different occasions, very, very briefly. He's one of my favorite comics creators and has been for decades, and was incredibly formative for me as a grown-up getting back into comics after that hiatus I had from my childhood. There were some brief years, I think, between the ages of 15 and 22 that I didn't read comics because I was very serious. I came back to reading comics with a whole number of discoveries of what the medium has been up to, or maybe was already doing before I quit. And Joe Sacco was one of the people I discovered at that time in my early 20s. Very, very influential and responsible for me giving comics a completely different view. Although I'd always loved the medium, taking me into a new realm of what's possible with the medium. His brand of comics journalism, it's very difficult to, even call it a brand, because he's almost the single person who does this. It's not to say that other people don't do comics journalism, but the way that Joe Sacco does it is very much his own thing. He's sort of a one-man genre in certain ways. And his books on Palestine and Bosnia, and there's footnote is Gaza, is one that we've talked about a couple of times on different occasions on this channel before. We haven't really talked about, I don't have a spotlight video on him because it's so intimidating, but I've never really mentioned journalism, his book of collected short pieces, which was also incredible because his longer work tends to sort of overshadow his shorter pieces. But this is somewhere right in between. This is longer than the short pieces you will find in journalism, but in some ways it is leaner than some of his mightier tomes, particularly A Footnote in Gaza. But this is a book that I was aware of for a long time because this is based in India. This is on an incident, ostensibly on a single incident. Of course, in typical Joe Sacco fashion, he goes much further and he goes much deeper. But this is based on a series of communal riots that broke out in 2013. And not only is it close to home for me for being in India, based in India, but it's also where these riots took place is not very far from where I live in the national capital. And even at the time in 2013, when they were taking place, there was this strange disconnect that I remember my friends and I talking about, like of how horrible things were just some kilometers, just some miles from where we were, and in the national capital. To imagine this going on essentially in your own neighborhood, it was sort of unbelievable to us how close to how raw stuff we were, and at the same time how oblivious and how disconnected we could be. And all of those conversations and all of those thoughts from that time sort of came rushing back in a deluge when I was reading this work. It sort of hammered that point home even more significantly to me. In some ways, it was one of the most illuminating things I've read, particularly because it was so close to home, and particularly because it showed me how little I still knew or understood about a situation that I was ostensibly so close to, that I held in such proximity. But the kind of examination that Joe Sacco does in this comic, the kind of investigation, the conversations that he has, but also really the questions that he raises, are at the same time vintage Sacco, very much what you would expect if you have read his other works, and at the same time seems to me, as someone who has read most of his major works, seems to me to be a new level in his storytelling, in his ability to get to the root, or at least worry the roots of a situation and an incident. His archaeological and investigative detective skills are one thing, but it's really what fuels that that stands out in this book, perhaps unlike any other of his books. I have mentioned before that there are certain works of Sacco's in which his anger or his, I don't want to say editorializing, but there is a certain indignation, there is a certain outrage that is very, very thinly veiled, that is underneath the surface of some of the stories that he tells. It's not all absolutely, what's the word I'm looking for? Absolutely neutral in its language, but it is extremely well researched. It's extremely well balanced in its coverage. There isn't this tokenistic two sides of the story sort of approach. It's a sort of constant niggling and worrying at these statements and these answers that he gets from everyone that he talks to. There is a level of judgment from the author, but it isn't one that is of any, it's not something that's simply partisan and, this side or that side. It's more how, to me, the way that this book stands out is how it insists that questions need to keep being asked. And every time you get an answer, every time you get a conclusion from anyone, that's just a single point of view. And where that conclusion is coming from, where that statement, why it needs to exist, is then further questioned. What does this person have to gain by saying this, by telling this story? All of this, because it's an extremely sensitive and fragile thing that he's talking about. He's talking about religious violence, communal violence. I wouldn't, even call it religious. It's this idea of us and them and the nature of how that can boil over into a mob mentality and how that mob mentality can take over regions and populations, leading to outright murder and bloodshed in the 21st century, in a democracy. But investigating the roots of that, investigating the roots of communal tension and religious friction in a place is something that Joe Sacco has done before. But as someone who is a citizen of India and someone who's been here and was here in 2013 when all of this happened, even to me, I think Joe Sacco is able to provide illumination of a sort that I found to be mind-boggling. So, which is to say that I think what he does in this book is display a sort of understanding of the situation that is a very complex situation in a way that even a local can not just admire, but learn a lot from. I think his outside point of view is not simply, getting over what biases might exist, but it's, to me, a very comprehensive view. It's very impressive to me how much he has been able to absorb, pick up, and put across with such clarity in what constitutes a very slim work, in relative terms, but also from the point of view of the thing he's talking about. And the riot that he's talking about here, even in India's history, it's not anywhere near the most destructive or the most violent as far as deaths are concerned. I mean, of course, there are deaths, but there have been far bigger riots in India. Communal violence, unfortunately, in India has a history that isn't limited to just this one incident. But he takes this one incident in this book to be a sort of microcosm, and through that, he tries to understand a lot more of history, a lot more of socio-political factions and frictions than I've seen most people attempt. And that's why I think the Once and Future Riot doesn't provide any answers, because it's just a series of questions. The only thing that it seems to say is these things will happen again, and why they will happen again is sort of given to us through the questions that he's asking. That's why the title, The Once and Future Riot, hits so hard. And by the time you end this book, because he ends it with even more questions, saying where does this stuff come from is not easily answerable. And all the answers you get can also be questioned, can be dismissed, can have things poked into them. And therefore, this book stands as an examination that isn't a textbook. It isn't about telling you or giving you an answer, but rather looking at why we should be questioning things that otherwise we would just accept. Any one political story, any one point of view, any one bias or prejudice could end up becoming the dominating truth, quote unquote, unless we've got the ability to ask and interrogate almost constantly. I don't really know what else to say about it, except that I found this to be a fantastic book, a very deeply unsettling, but also an incredibly satisfying book, not because of what it gives you is any kind of closure, quite the opposite, but because the manner in which it asks these questions, the manner in which it empathizes, but also puts on display the human face of not just the victims, but the perpetrators of this violence, many of whom are interviewed and who get to speak their piece over here. It gives you all these stories and all these opposing stories and points of views right next to each other in a truly eye-opening way. Joe Sacco's The Once and Future Riot is a fantastic comic that I highly recommend to anyone, but particularly to people who wish to understand complicated things like communal violence in a place like India, for people who are interested in investigative journalism, for people who are interested in stories about the human condition and history and politics and the kind of recent history that Joe Sacco is such an chronicler of. This is one of my favorite, if not my, it might be The Hangover or it might be the glow of recency, but this feels to me like one of my favorite works by Joe Sacco, long or short. And I honestly can't wait to get back into it again once some time has passed. I want to give this a reread because I feel that there, again, is a lot that remains to be unpacked and discovered in this. If you have a chance to give this a look, I highly, highly recommend The Once and Future Riot by Joe Sacco. Let me quickly check up on the chat over here. Good to see you, Hazem. We've got Ent March, Dipesh, good to see you. And Kevin, good to see you. Long time no see. Yes, I have been well. I have been busy, but here I am back on YouTube. Although, as I was saying at the top of the live stream, I've been on YouTube just on other people's channels. But yes, this is a return to my own channel, and hopefully more live streams at least and edited videos will be following on a far more regular basis now. At least as one of my New Year resolutions. Stuart, good to see you. All right, so that was The Once and Future Riot by Joe Sacco. Next up, we have, well, we'll do a couple of quick ones perhaps, and then we'll move on to something, again, a little, well, I don't know. We'll take it as it goes. Next, we have Asadora by Naoki Urasawa. And this is volume 1 of this manga that I've had sitting on my shelves for a while, but only recently got around to reading it. I don't know why I didn't. I am a fan of Urasawa, although I will have to say that it has been up and down. I am an absolute fan of a couple of works, in particular Pluto, which is one of my favorite comics and one of my favorite sci-fi comics. I've talked about it numerous times. I recommend it highly to people. I haven't read past the first couple of volumes of 20th Century Boys, and that's a series of his that I need to find my way to other volumes of. And I think it was Monster, which was the one Urasawa that I didn't quite latch onto. And I don't know if it was Monster that was the last thing I read or didn't go further than the first volume with. But I did want to read Asadora, and then there were people who recommended Asadora to me. I don't have any excuse except sometimes you pick something up and it sits there and you're wondering why you didn't read it. And now when I finally did, I feel it's one of those classic cases in which I feel a little foolish of not having gotten into this. Not having gotten to this earlier. I don't know what I was worried about. Either I thought it was very cutesy, which, I mean, of course it is. You can see from that illustration in one way, but it's not a cutesy story. And then I wasn't sure if, I mean, I'm not really sure. I'm trying to think about how much I knew about the story before I went in. And I think it's because I didn't know anything other than it was about a young girl. But this young girl story, now that I have read it, strikes me as a very weird and interesting mixture of a kind that I absolutely expect Urasawa to have built. Now, without too many spoilers, I will say that this mixes together wartime drama, kidnapping, thriller, a sort of relationship story between a young girl and a slightly shady, villainous, older kidnapper, someone who actually kidnaps her, mistaken identity, but then puts all of this stuff together, including the wartime drama, with a sort of monster movie idea. But the monster stuff is, I mean, it's an important part of the story, but it really takes a little bit of a background, at least in this first volume, to the sort of human character drama that we have. At the same time, unlike, say, Pluto, or even the little bit of Monster that I read, this isn't an outright dark and foreboding or portent sort of soaked story. There is drama in it, but there is also a lightness to it. There is a joy, there is comedy, and that was something that I don't know if I was expecting, which is not to say that Urasawa's usual mastery of the form as far as composition, as far as transitions, and as far as the way he does sequence is, in any way mitigated or lessened in this story. There is some superb action, there is fantastic compositions, but you also have this larger monster attack stuff in the in the background every now and then coming into the foreground. But it does feel most of all like an adventure, and that is something I think I wasn't aware of. I wasn't sure that it's going to be there. I mean, I had no idea it was going to be there. It was going to be that sort of thing. So it's a fantastic mixture, one that is completely unique, one that feels at times melodramatic, sometimes realistic, sometimes like a fantasy action adventure, sometimes like a small intimate character drama, but blends these things in quite impressively into one go without, you've got comedy and drama and tension sort of right next to each other. The lightness of touch and the seriousness of tone blends together perfectly. And it did give me some it felt a little bit like Godzilla -1, a movie that I really admired. It doesn't have a lot of similarity. There is that larger monster thing, of course, as I said, but also this notion of this found family, this idea of people coming together and helping each other together and achieving these skills, and of course the wartime story together sort of has shades of that, although it would be unfair of me to compare it any further than that. Volume 1 was a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to reading the other volumes. Luckily, I don't think there are as many as there are in some of the other series. I think this might be a 4, maybe a 5 volume story. If I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments or in the chat. But yes, this is another one that I would recommend to people. If you're a fan of Urasawa's, I don't think I need to recommend to you something like this, because this seems like an easy pickup. But if you've never read any Urasawa, I don't think this is a bad place to start. I think this is accessible and impressive at the same time. I still think that Pluto is something that personally, broke my heart in such a way that I'm always going to consider it a certain kind of masterpiece. So I'll have to read more of this to see if this kind of compares to that or gets up to that level. But there's no real reason for comparison other than the fact that they're made by the same creator. So also recommended from me is Asadora Volume 1, and I'll keep you abreast on what I think about future volumes. Volume 9 just came out, Mad Bomber says. Oh my God. Well, yeah, I better start buying these before it becomes too intimidating for me to get into. Man, I really thought that the series was going to be a 5-volume series. March says that Urasawa has an amazing documentary show called Manben, where he sits with various manga artists and goes over their work. Oh, interesting. Is this on YouTube? March? Let me know, because that might be something worth having on in the background or listening to while I'm trying to do work. We've got Omar in Canada. Good to see you, Omar. Thanks for joining the stream, even if it is for a little while. Yes, hopefully the recording will be up for you to catch up on at any point of time in the future as well. Volume 9 just came out. How many in total? We do not know. All right. Well, Volume 2, I suppose, is the way to go. I just realized I don't really need these headphones, do I? This is kind of monitoring, so I know that I'm not clipping or I'm getting too soft, but winter is on its way out here in New Delhi, so it's already starting to get warm. I will remove my headphones and let me know in the chat if my volume drops too low or if I start clipping or something like that. Hopefully these levels will also help. It is on YouTube. Okay, good to know. I will have to make a note of that. See, this is why I love coming back to these streams. It's to go through the chat and find all of these references and recommendations. What do we have next? She and Her Cat. This is a manga that I knew nothing about. I think this was a present from Ashwata to me. She found it on Amazon. She thought it looked cool and interesting. I don't know if it was on sale. And this is another one of those things that for the longest time just sat on one side. This is published by Vertical Comics, Kodansha.us. But it looked kind of flimsy. Like I wasn't sure if this was, like it didn't look very polished in its production. It looks handsome enough as far as the cutting is concerned. The printing inside seems to be fine. So I guess it's just a little bit of a cover design thing. And as I said, I knew nothing by it. The cover says story by Makoto Shinkai and art by Tsubasa Yamaguchi. Not names that I am familiar with. However, in reading through this, I found myself strangely allured, even though I didn't think I would like it. I thought it was a little, it's going to be real slow and it's going to be about a woman with her cat. And that's the whole idea from the initial pages. But it ended up being a lot. So I think this is, if you can see this page, this is the page that made the impression on me. And I wasn't sure what to expect, but I thought it would be cute and it would be, a cat's point of view on a life in an apartment, maybe even a comedy, especially when you have things like on this side of the page, with the eating and the burping. Very cartoony, very friendly, very warm and cuddly. And that's what I was expecting. But this is actually a story about a tough time emotionally. This single girl, her life at home slowly becomes more and more revealed to us, and all from the point of view of the cat. And the cat doesn't necessarily understand everything. And so, what I found to be quite interesting is how much of this was just in media res, where you just have to take the scene, you have to overhear snippets of a conversation, you have to hear the girl talking to herself, you get something from the phone, you get half a conversation, and you don't necessarily understand all of it, just in the way that the cat doesn't understand all of it. But as you read this story, it ended up being a story about loneliness, about depression, about finding or losing love, living by yourself in a big city, parents, far away from you. It was strangely touching and insightful and felt deep. Now, at times it did feel a little amateurish, but I couldn't tell whether that was a bad thing necessarily. There felt like there was a rawness to it, a rawness to the observation and to the way that life was looked at. And then it got kind of dark and sad. And it was, in fact, about depression and tragedy. Although you never get them very explicitly, you just know that it's that way because you continue to always be in the point of view of the cat. I was surprised. I did not expect to be as moved as I was by this, even though I think that it doesn't have the polish that I've seen in some other manga. It had a heart and, as I said, a rawness to it that really appealed to me. And this is one of those things that I never would have thought, but that I would like. But I was surprised at how much I loved it. This is also, I think, just a one-volume story. From what research I did after I read, I realized that this was based on a film. So this is essentially, there is an anime, and it's, I think, a short film, or it's a 30-minute film. It's not a feature-length film, but this is an adaptation, a manga adaptation of that film. I'm not sure if more stuff has been added to this, because this definitely feels like it would be more than 30 minutes as a film. So I don't know if more has been added to this. So Makoto Shinkai was the original filmmaker, and it's then Tsubasa Yamaguchi is the adapter into the manga form. So the manga was probably commissioned by Kodansha given the success of the film and stuff like that. But as a standalone thing, me not having seen the movie, I can see how some of this stuff would have maybe been depicted in animated form, in a movie form. But I think in manga form, it does a really good job with the way that it moves time, the way that it shows you this life, and uses the comics page and the comics format quite admirably. So at no point of time did I really think about it as a weak adaptation. I didn't even imagine that it was an adaptation, which I think of as rather a compliment to the way this is put together. All right, back to the comments real quick. It is a Japanese podcast with subtitles, so it cannot be background listening. Very well, then. I shall have to. I don't speak Japanese. Good to see you, Sleepy Reader. Long time no see. Sleepy Reader, we're looking forward. So maybe I should mention a little bit now. Earlier I had said I'll talk about this a little later, but since we have Sleepy Reader over here, a thing that I'm really excited about that we're going to do in 2 weeks is we're going to do a big 6-person conversation over on Highland G's channel. It's usually Matthew, Highland G, and myself. We have this conversation every month. We try to do one, and we try to do different kind of things. But this time there are going to be 3 guests, including Sleepy Reader over here, who are big fans and experts Strangers in Paradise, the Terry Moore comic, and it's something that all of us are going to read. Many of us in that group are going to be reading it as a reread. Not me. I'm going to be reading it for the first time. So that's something that's coming up in the works. I think 2 weeks from now. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, 6 people talking about the first 35 issues of Strangers in Paradise, keep an eye out for that. And I'll be putting stuff up on the community page and on the Instagram page to make sure that people know when it's coming up. All right, moving on to what we have now is... Oh, I'll give an honorable mention. As I said, this is a recent reads video, not so much a recent reads and new acquisitions. So this is a new acquisition, the New York trilogy, Paul Auster's New York trilogy by Paul Karasik. And this is the graphic adaptations of City of Glass, Ghosts, and The Locked Room. I have not read this yet, so this is why it's just something that arrived recently, but I am excited to get my hands on it because the first book, City of Glass, by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli, is a fantastic comic, and I've talked about it, I think, a couple of times, most notably on the 31 Days of Comics for the category A Great Adaptation from Another Medium. I picked City of Glass as my pick for that day, and I talk about it over there. But the other two, Ghosts and The Locked Room, by other adapters, I don't think David Mazzucchelli is involved in the other two, but it's Lorenzo Mattotti and Paul Karasik doing Ghosts and The Locked Room. All three of them are put together over here. In fact, the other two, Ghosts and The Locked Room, have never been published before, from what I could see. It's only City of Glass that was published, and now the other two are collected in here. So, as I said in my post, City of Glass was a challenging read, but it was a rewarding read. I think it is a magnificent comic out of some difficult writing. It's not an easy comic, but it's not absolutely opaque. It really rewards, attention, which I love. And so therefore, I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth into the entire trilogy, which will also give me a chance to reread City of Glass. If City of Glass is something that you enjoyed, I think you should take a look at the New York trilogy and see if that's something. But yes, Sleepy Reader, I feel sorry for artists who have to follow Mazzucchelli as well. So I think what is interesting about this is that, all right, so here is the Paul Karasik, Mazzucchelli type of artwork, and we, of course, it's magnificent. So what I think is happening is, like, it's a completely different style. So I think if you're going to follow Mazzucchelli, that's the way to do it, is to approach it, using something that isn't trying to be a replicator or isn't trying to match the style of the previous book. And so just in having flipped through it, when I see something like that, I'm like, okay, I think that's something. Otherwise, I would feel very much the same as you. It's just like, ooh, that's going to be a tough act to follow. All right. I was going to say, speaking of tough acts to follow, but that segue does not work at all. So we'll just say Image Comics. The next 3 books that I have over here are 3 Image trade paperbacks. Regulars of this channel will know that I'm a big fan of picking up the first trade paperback of Image Comics because they give me a wonderful sampler of what's out there. And usually, I won't say this is always the case, but usually they're priced quite reasonably compared to the way comics are priced these days. So even here in India, it isn't unheard of to be able to pick up, for like $7, $8, $9 a trade paperback. And that is a good way that I have found to try out things, because otherwise, you just don't want to take the risk. I have got 3 trades over here, and all of them are trades that I have, to a certain extent or the other, enjoyed quite a bit. The first up is Volume 1 of Public Domain by Chip Zdarsky. Now, I have not read a lot of Chip Zdarsky comics. I know that he's very big in the Marvel DC, the superhero world. I think the first work of his that I read, and probably the one that I've read the most of, is his work with Matt Fraction on sex criminals. So not one of the big two, his independent creator-owned stuff. But I also I think there was a Jughead volume that when he started writing Archie comics that I picked up and I quite enjoyed. But I know that he's a very funny guy. He's a very witty guy. Friends of mine are always telling me about, some funny tweets that he had out there. Me being a social media ignoramus in many ways, I'm not aware of all of that stuff, but I know that he's, a very intelligent and a very wittily intelligent person. So when I saw public domain, well, I didn't know anything about it other than public domain. So I wasn't, again, sure what I was thinking of. I'm like, ooh, does he play with some public domain characters? Does he take some golden age superheroes and work with that? Which I was thinking what the story would be. I thought this would be a good thing for me to try out. Also, this is not just an independent creator-owned work, but it's something that's written and drawn by him, which I'm always interested in. I'm interested in seeing what people do when they're writing and drawing themselves, especially people who often work as not just both writer and artist, but sometimes they're the artist for someone else writing, sometimes they're the writer for someone else drawing. I find that fascinating. And so therefore, when they write and draw themselves, it makes me more likely to pick that up, because I somehow think, I'm going to get a one view of this, and then I'll get different views when I read when they collaborate. But what I was surprised about was that this is in some ways a comic about a superhero, but it's not a superhero comic. It's about making superhero comics. And it starts with this, our protagonist having some baggage about his father, but his father was a very famous comic book artist. But the character that he created with a writer, Domain, he is not really that known for it. The writer is the guy who got most of the credit, who's been able to parlay it into a Hollywood career, and who's successful and rich, and the artist is kind of forgotten and broke and penniless. And it's this story about rights and permissions and licensing and money and corporations that public domain ended up being about. And it's strangely a low-key family drama in many ways. And it has, at the same time, twists and turns in it. Not huge dramatic twists and turns until one big, huge dramatic twist and turn. And then the setup of it, I really don't want to spoil it, because it was... I was waiting for something outrageous and big to happen. And I think that might just be my expectations from what I think Chip Zdarsky does and what kind of stories he writes. At the same time, I was quite comfortable in reading what I said, like a lower key family drama sort of thing. The characters took me a little while to get warmed up to, particularly the protagonist, but his brother and his father were more easily attachable to, at least for me, and that helped me ease into this story. And by the end of the first volume, I was quite kicked. I had been entertained and I'd had a good time. I could see some of the strings sort of coming together in a TV show sort of way, of where pieces are being moved and you're like, oh, okay, that person's going to end up partnering with them and that person's going to end up working with them. You can see some of that stuff coming, but it's so plain. I mean, I don't mean plain. It's so easy to read. It's so smooth, and it's so... it keeps you on your toes. The story keeps moving, that I was entertained. I'm not sure about some of the art approaches, like particularly something like this, with this fuzzy, soft focus background. I'm not really sure what that's trying to replicate, whether that's trying to be shallow depth of field or something like that. But it doesn't necessarily work all the time. I'm okay with just giving me solid, flat colors especially in the close-ups and things like that. But I thought otherwise it was quite, the dialogue felt, like when I look at the facial expressions and the body language and read the speech bubbles, it felt evocative. I could hear voices, as I said, smooth reading, and I was entertained. Will I pay $20 for the second trade paperback of Public Domain? Probably not, but that has more to do with me, no longer being employed in the corporate sector. And, it's not really a diss on the story as it is. But should I be able to pick up more trades of this, I would like to see where the story goes. If you have read it further than the first volume, I'd love to know what your opinion of it is. Although, if you've read more than one volume, you must have been enjoying it. But, let me know if it falls off a cliff or if it gets better, what your thoughts of it are. I thought this was a pretty good first book. But I will say it is a little bit of a, as much as you do get full arcs and stories, it does feel, by the time you end it, it does feel a little setup-y. Where you're just like, all right, I got 5 issues, and 5 issues got me to a particular point, and that's fun. Now, if I thought that was the end of the story, I would have wanted maybe a little bit more, but it's very obviously not the end of the story. So therefore, it's one of those things which is like, okay, so this is a setup for a longer running series, but how much longer? What are they going to do with it? Those are the kind of questions that remain to be seen. But otherwise, yeah, not bad. I enjoyed Public Domain. Yes, Little Bird is on this list as well. Karasik was doing the storyboards, Shrelp says, and deliberating with others rather than Mazzucchelli. Yes, and I think that it's something that he mentions in the introduction for City of Glass as well. It's very much a Paul Karasik project, and he's got these artists collaborating with him on it. And Mazzucchelli also didn't do all of the illustrations or didn't do all of the panels or pages for City of Glass. Paul Karasik did a number of them. I think Mazzucchelli was brought in for particular character work and longer, I think some of the city walking shots and things like that. So I know that it's a much more collaborative thing than 100% the artist. Sleepy Reader says that Zdarsky is an almost chameleonic writer. Ooh, I like that. I like writers who can just change based on the material they're working on, based on the story they want to tell. I love it. As much as I love voicey authors, you can only take so much of them in a row, and so you've got to sort of walk away from them and come back to it. And after a while, you might start thinking, okay, it's a shtick, and then that one is my favorite and the others are inferior. Whereas with chameleonic writers, I think there's an opportunity to have many favorites, which is always a great thing. I'd love to know what other stuff by Chip Zdarsky I should read. I know, again, as I was saying, I know that he's got some famous Marvel stuff. I'm trying to remember if there was a Spider-Man that he wrote that I tried to read in trade paperback from somewhere, but I might be confusing it with something. But yes, Public Domain was interesting. I'd like to know more about it if people have any opinions on that too. There is also a graphic novel, which is the comic in Public Domain, if that makes sense. There is a graphic novel, which is the comic in Public Domain. You'll have to explain that to me a little bit. Super laugh hard. Okay, the next trade I have over here is Die, Volume 1, Fantasy Heartbreaker by Kieron Gillen and Stephanie Hans. This is the first trade paperback. This collects issues 1 through 5. This, I believe, is a series that is now done. I think there are 5 trade paperback volumes, so 25 issues. But correct me if I'm wrong. I hope it's not a 50-issue 10 volume and that I've just misseen this. Now, the way that this has been mentioned, now Kieron Gillen, the person, the writer of The Wicked and the Divine, I've read The Wicked and the Divine, which I really enjoyed. I thought that was a good series. I've never seen anything by Stephanie Hans, whose artwork here I mean, I liked it, but it took me some getting used to once again as a comics, as comics art, just looking at it in sequence, looking at it panel after panel. There is some wonderful color work, some wonderful compositions in this comic. But what was interesting, what was most interesting to me, and then there is obviously variation on the art style with things like this as well, which I absolutely love. What was interesting to me about this, what drew me to this, is it's about games and it's about game playing, and it's a dark fantasy, very reminiscent in superficial ways of Jumanji, of kids who play a game who get taken away. So in the 90s, 6 teenagers disappeared into a fantasy role-playing game. Only 5 returned. Nearly 30 years later, these broken adults are dragged back to discover the game isn't finished with them yet. And it also, obviously, alongside something like Jumanji or, I guess, Stranger Things today, it is reminiscent of Stephen King horror stories, particularly something like It, where you've got this group of kids with this shared trauma in their childhood and trying to return to it as adults. And it's exactly that. You have this group, this rather eclectic group of friends in the mid 90s who start playing this, not quite a TTRPG, not quite a board game, but yeah, a fantasy game. And in playing this game, they disappear. And when they come back, they're missing a friend of theirs. They come back 2 years later. So they disappear in the mid 90s. They come back 2 years later, still in the mid 90s. One of them has lost an arm, and they never talk about where they've been or what they've seen or what happened. And then you have 25 years later, they gather again, go into this world, and then find out what happened to their friend. I thought it was an interesting idea. I wasn't sure about what it would do that was new to the genre. And I have to say that for a fair amount of time, I'll say the first issue, has this setup. That's fine. The second issue, I wasn't quite feeling it necessarily. I loved the way that it was being presented, but I wasn't really sure whether I was I was buying into that whole dark fantasy premise and this brooding sort of darkness and this seriousness. It's not to say that it's absolutely dark, but there isn't a lot of comedy in it, which I think in some ways is a good thing. You don't want it to be all quippy stuff, but then you do have some, young people talking to each other type of language. You have people who are, arguing with each other, fighting with each other. But once again, as I was reading it, I started to feel the story a little bit more. I think the characters over here are playing types, and that would normally not be very interesting to me. But this does have the additional layer of they're supposed to be types. This one's the barbarian melee fighter, and that one's the sorcerer, and this one's the clever trickster. All of these kind of things are part and parcel of this. There are a couple of things that to me strike me as that, this is a poster, this is a pin-up more than it is a comics panel. But that might just be me. There are things that we read comics for that are very much about this. Now, I've talked in the past about some dark fantasy or some fantasy comics that haven't quite worked for me. And in spite of having a lot of different things, I think two of the ones, and I don't want to be too negative here, but they just, to me, they didn't quite work. One was, like, for example, Jason Aaron's God Country, and the other one was Monstrous. And both God Country and Monstrous are incredibly well considered, well reviewed, and well thought of titles. So it's just me. But they didn't appeal to me because I didn't understand. In one case, I didn't understand what's at stake. I didn't understand, what's the blue beam, what's the purple beam, what's all this, etc., etc. And the other one, I felt that the writing wasn't, in spite of the art and the world's visual presentation, the writing wasn't quite catching me. In this one, I was worried that it would be along those lines. It would be something that is a whole lot of sheen, a whole lot of polish, but not a lot of substance. But once again, I have to say that I kind of got into the language over here. I got into the vocabulary of this comic, both the textual vocabulary as well as the imagistic vocabulary. So I started and I started getting into it, and I started buying into the dark fantasy a little bit. To me, the dark fantasy, again, it depends on what we're talking about, but it can be a little much, where it feels, like, I don't want to sound too condescending, but I don't want it to only be like, oh, when you're 19 and you've just discovered death metal or something like that. It seems a little one-dimensional. But I found that the sort of tragedy that this starts dealing with, and the kind of trauma and damage that this kind of dealing with, it started making its way into my bones. I won't say that I'm absolutely blown away with it, but I did start appreciating it for what it was, which was this dark fantasy with this larger lore and this sort of myth being built around this world and what happened to their companion, the one that they left behind. It has all of these sort of classic trappings and all of this type stuff, as I was saying, but it seems to be doing some interesting things with these characters as well. I do think that I'll need to read a little bit more to know, but it is one of those things that I do want to read a little bit more, and I do want to see what happens next. So I'll definitely give Volume 2 a try, and then I'll use Volume 2 to decide whether this is a series worth completing for me. Again, I can also return to this, because even now when I'm flipping through it and I'm remembering, oh, that wasn't too bad. That was pretty cool. And that I liked, all right. So I'm finding that maybe I'm being too rough on it or being too difficult with it. Whereas I actually did enjoy it more than I remember enjoying it, more than I'm giving off. So Die Volume 2 is something that, again, I will look for. If you have read this and if you know anything about it, or if you have an opinion on it, I'd love for you to share that as well. More water. Check the chat before moving on. Spider-Man Life Story. That's probably what I'm thinking of, Ritwik, but I don't think I've read it. I think that's the one I wanted to read, the Chip Zdarsky that I was most interested in. Oh, the superhero comic in public domain has actually been published in real life. That's interesting. Oh, that reminds me that, it's something like, like how The Escapist, the comic that Cavalier and Clay make in Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, was made into a comic as well with a variety of people. And I think Die has an RPG that is based in this world and based in this mythology. I'm interested in RPGs. I have also now a couple of RPGs that are based on properties that I've enjoyed. The Avatar, The Last Airbender RPG, and the Mouse Guard RPG. So if I like Volume 2 of this, I might even seek out that RPG and see how that because those are things that are appealing to me. Amazing premises. For most of Gillen, amazing premises, great execution, but always a little distant, too smart to be emotional, perhaps. That's a good point. I do think there are people who are very smart, and I think we can see this in the way that, say, sometimes people talk about Christopher Nolan or, other things where they're like, oh, there's a real intelligence here. There's a real intellect here. There's no doubt about that, but I'm not necessarily connecting with it at an emotional level the way that you would want it to, but you are admiring of that. And then there are people like, I'm a big fan of Matt Kint, Jeff Lemire. I think there are people like that who are able to do that for me. They're able to take the smart, conceptually twisting, postmodern sort of thing, but also give it a real human emotional heft. So with Dai, that's, if there's anything missing, that's the thing. I think you've identified it. I'm still a little distant from the characters, and it would not be something I would go, but because they're playing archetypes and because they're supposed to be game archetypes, I might be cutting them a little bit of slack, if that makes sense, is because of that artifice. In any other context, I may not be as forgiving. Oh, Sleepy Reader says yes, exactly. All right, which takes us to the next thing, and maybe we can have more conversation about this. So, if that's what we thought, or that's what I think about Die, then what did I think about Little Bird, written by Darcy Van Poelgeest, who is a filmmaker, I think, and drawn by Ian Bertram, and this is the 2020 Eisner Award winner for Best Limited Series. This is a comic that a number of people have told me that I should check out, especially when I mentioned to them that I do like fantasy and I do like serious fantasy and I like to see what is done with fantasy in comics, etc. And then when I mentioned this as one of the books that I had picked up in one of my previous things, people were like, oh, this one got called out. Like, I can't wait to hear what you think of that, which was a lot of pressure on me and on this poor book, because that's a lot to live up to in many ways. Little Bird is also, I guess, a fantasy thing, a fantasy story, although it could be sci-fi fantasy in many ways. It is set in a dystopian future, which has, it reminds me of, there are things in it that remind me of Dune. There are things in it that remind me of, I don't know, Star Wars and all of these things. It almost seems a little cliche, but the art style is also incredibly detailed and icky and quite tactile. It's just lovely. The colors are popping. It reminds me of a number of different comics, actually. I was trying to think of who it reminds me of most, but there are there's obviously some Mobius and Brandon Graham type of influences. I think some of these figures, and especially the way they're lined, is reminds me of Derek Robertson's work, particularly in Transmetropolitan. There is shades of the Manhattan Projects, and that might have to do with the colors and stuff like that as well. Frank Quietly is someone else who comes to mind when looking at this. And all of those things are very good, in my opinion, very good influences or references that I'm pointing out. But Ian Bertram's work is it's also unique. It's not just that, it's something else as well. And I think this world that is being built over here, this horrible, dystopian, violent world with this death and reincarnation, was fascinating to me, particularly for its visual presentation. I thought it was absolutely magnificent in so many ways, where I was drawn to the page and peering into it, trying to grab a sight of all of these details that I'm seeing in the compositions, colors, and the artwork in particular. And the story, honestly, is also, I mean, I can't divorce the story from the artwork. The artwork is the story in so many ways. And because of the way it looks and feels and flows, I found it to be quite a propulsive action story, a very gory one, a very intriguing one. And of course, as I'm saying, all of those influences that I just mentioned, including Mobius, are showing up on every page. However, having said all that, I wasn't absolutely blown away by the writing. The story to me felt ambitious, but not completely baked out. And at the same time, I'm quite willing to accept that, oh, there might be a lot of stuff that I'm not getting. Although there are pages like this, which is just like sheer violence and things like that. And there's nothing for me not to get. This is great. This is wonderful. But I wasn't sure at some things very small and practical. I'm not sure what people's powers are and what their abilities are, why certain things kill them and why certain things don't, how certain things destroy them, why. And then there were larger things, like I wasn't sure about the compulsions of all of the characters, of the various power factions and the of the power factions and the politics and the groups and things like that. There were times where I was right there with it, and there were times when I was a little lost, or I didn't really know how this connected to that. This is one of those things where I firmly believe that it's very much about you, and there would be somebody else who would look at the same things that I'm looking at and go, oh my God, that's magnificent, that's fantastic. And when it comes to the visual presentation of it, not just as I was saying in the figures and the artwork, but the sort of compositional work over here, I don't think there's any doubt about it. But when it comes to the full story as an epic piece of fantasy, what is being promised to me by these images, what's being promised to me by the first glance of the pages, for me, unfortunately, wasn't lived up to by the writing, by the plotting, and particularly by the character motivations, which is not to say that it's bad by any means. This is an incredible, indelible sort of work in many, many ways. And I would love to see more of it in, I've heard that there is a prequel to this, and I'm definitely interested in finding everything else that Ian Bertram works on. But it's not just that. I don't want to, like this world that it's showing me over here, just like Dune, just like Foundation, just like the Incal, it's an incredibly intriguing world. It's just the story plot lines and the characters, to me, didn't live up to that promise. But of course, that's just me. I mean, I know that there are lots and lots of people who absolutely love Little Bird, and I have no doubt that it is worth that kind of thing. I'm just not able to get to it at that 100% way, the way that, some great science fiction, some great fantasy does, which is absolutely transport me somewhere and make me forget where I am and make me want to live in that. The kind of stuff that has happened even with not as serious or not as dark things, like stuff that Brandon Graham has done, as I've talked about him, Rain Like Hammers, and more recently, even something like Moonray, which I think is great, but it's not as great as Rain Like Hammers. Again, the only reason I compare is because it's the same people. But that science fiction, even Brandon Graham stuff on Prophet, which, I could try to link to this in some ways, is mind-blowing. And even if I don't love every single thing in Prophet, there is enough in it that is transporting me and captivating me in a way that Little Bird didn't quite do for me. But again, would I want to read more comics that look like this? Would I want to read more of this comic to see more of these lands and more of these people and more of these tribes? Of course I would. Why wouldn't I? I just wish that it, I just wish that it had put together that entire picture for me in a more complete way. Let me go back to the comments and see how many people are pissed off with that. Sleepy Reader says, I seem to be the only one who isn't crazy about Van Poelgeest writing. All right, well, thank goodness, Sleepy Reader. Maybe you and I have an agreement on this. I mean, again, I don't want to diss on all of it. But to me, the writing, plot, and concept is muddy and half-baked. I think I will agree with you on that. It is muddy, and I didn't quite, and I'm fine with something not being explained to me. I'm fine with not knowing, but I want that not knowing to be a very mysterious sort of thing. And there was also some writing over there which struck me as very quippy and therefore anachronistic in certain environments. which I think I had a problem with Monstrous as well, where I'm like, this is like a Netflix TV Marvel movie type of Joss Whedon-esque kind of thing, but not based in character. And and it's sort of, and you've got all this, deep portentous stuff, and then you've got all of this stuff that is supposed to lighten it, but they're not consistent with each other. And I think that creates more friction and more of that muddiness. And of course, that larger kind of thing that I was talking about, the politics, the worlds, the way it works, the power structures, the superhero powers or whatever, all of those things were also not only not explained to me, but they didn't hold together with enough consistency for me. But the art is even better in the prequel. Excited to read Precious Metal. He's upped his game in the prequel. All right, that's interesting. Yes, Precious Metal. I will check it out. I'm interested in it, as I said, but couldn't follow the plot in the prequel. I found it frustrating. Okay, Sleepy Reader, you've warned me. I've gotten your warning over there. Some extent, the writing in Little Bird and Precious Metal. I recommend you check out House of Penance, where Bertram's art is paired with Peter J. Tomasi's writing. All right, House of Penance. I'm going to make a note of that. I will definitely be checking that out. He's definitely the best part of the book. House of Penance has great work from him too. All right, so House of Penance is the one. Well, I'll write it down now, but I will also come back to this to check on all of these recommendations. So do keep them coming. I mean, it's an Eisner winner for best series, so what is my view on it? And that's one of those great things about writing or talking about things years after they've come out. Is like you can sort of get over the initial buzz of things and hopefully give a more considered response, which is the way I like sometimes to do when I read something like say with the Joe Sacco book. I just read it. It's a relatively new book and I'm blown away by it. But I'm like, this is the best thing I've read this year. Now, will I think that at the end of the year? Probably. Will I think that 5 years from now? Probably, but maybe not, so maybe I should have waited a year or so to talk about it. But again, I'm talking about it as close to me reading it. I do want to say that Little Bird, just like Die, has stuff in it to recommend. It does have many things in it that I enjoyed. It's that full package. And that full package doesn't mean that something something that I consider a full package will have better art or better colors. That's not really it's about how it all comes together in that one piece, which is what I felt about, the way that I enjoyed the Urasawa comic, the way that I enjoyed the Joe Sacco comic, even the way that I enjoyed, they will have, I can't think about the strong caveats that I have against the Joe Sacco and the Urasawa comic, but all of the other ones, there are other things that we can talk about. But talking about full packages, and the last book, sort of as a good bookend with the Joe Sacco book, is Eleanor Davis's The Hard Tomorrow. And this book is not a recent book, I don't think. I think this is I think it came out in 2019, and that's important because what it's talking about, yes, so this is April 2019 is when it came out. So this is before 2020, and it's talking about America, and it's talking about politics, and it's talking about a number of things that today might seem almost quaint in how much has changed in 5-6 years. It's incredible. But this has to do with activism, with protests, with climate change, but also with love, motherhood, wanting to have a baby, trying to get pregnant, not being able to get pregnant. Eleanor Davis is an artist and a writer whose work I have incredible admiration for. So to a certain extent, I was half sold on it just because it's Eleanor Davis. If you're not familiar, I think I must have talked about Eleanor Davis's How to Be Happy. I don't know how many years ago. Maybe it's in that live stream that I made, 6 comics to read before you die, or 6 comics I would reread Before I Die. Maybe How to Be Happy was over there, but How to Be Happy is a collection of short stories by Eleanor Davis that I highly recommend to anyone. They're fantastic comics. It's an incredible range of art styles and storytelling chops that she displays in those collection of short stories. Some of them are creation myths almost. Some of them are sci-fi, some of them are fantasy, some of them are slice of life, some of them feel like fairy tales. It's incredible. That collection of short stories is a mind-boggling collection of short stories. And the other Eleanor Davis stuff that I've read after that has been quite like there's Why Art, I think, and You and Me and a Bike. You and a Bike and a Road, which is more of a little journal travelogue sort of thing, which are good, but they're more thought pieces than outright just fiction. And this is a novel, so this is to me what I've been waiting for from Eleanor Davis. No shade on Why Art and You and Me and a Bike and a Road, but no, yeah, not. But this one is a novel, and this one is a novel that feels like a true American novel in the big serious sort of way. It deals with so many different things of a particular point in time and a particular level of how much do we put up with, and what do we stand for, and what do we stand against, and how do we protest, and who are the people that whose lives we touch and whose lives touch us. All of these really heady questions being given to us in this not quite slice of life, because slice of life makes it seem sedentary. It makes it seem this is not sedentary. There's a lot of stuff going on over here. There is relationships and stuff between people in relationships, and the ideas of power and struggling against power. But what can the common man do? What can the common person do? At the same time, it's an extremely hopeful story, even though it deals with things, and that's why I was thinking it might seem quaint today, where some of the hope in this might seem almost misplaced. But this also deals with a world in which it feels almost hopeless. It's just there are certain people who don't quite give up, or the way they live is so different from what I can imagine. Living and growing your own things and living in a trailer. Of course, you've got some what's the word, like a survival conspiracy theorist type of person, like a person who just has a bunker with cans of food. You've got all of that stuff as well, but you also have this hippie-ish kind of lifestyle. You have taking care of our central character. She lives in a trailer with her boyfriend, husband. They're trying to get pregnant, but she works at a home for the elderly, a sort of hospice almost sort of area. And it's in the midst of this that she's also becoming politically aware, but not becoming politically aware. She's being politically activistic, but there is also this push and pull from people in that group, and then her home life, and then her work life, and all of these coming together in this story that to me was an incredible work. I loved this comic. It is, I guess, not for everyone if that sort of story isn't to your taste. But my question would be, what sort of story is that? This is very much its own thing. It's got some peculiar moments in it that I myself was just like, what? Are you serious? Or something like that. But it's so poetic, and it's so heartbreaking in so many ways. And at the same time, it has such a lovely view of humanity and what is possible without it becoming preachy, without it becoming lecturing, while being very, very mired in these particular characters and their particular wants and desires. And it ends on a lovely, lovely note, even though it doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't answer any questions. It's sort of an uplifted note that you leave the story with, and a series of double-page spreads that I thought were magnificent. Eleanor Davis's The Hard Tomorrow from 2019. It took me like 5-6 years to read it, get my hands on it, thanks to a sale. But I'm very happy that I did. A lovely book, highly recommended. As are other Eleanor Davis books, in particular, How to Be Happy, which is a fantastic book as well. So that's The Hard Tomorrow by Eleanor Davis, Little Bird by Darcy Van Poelgeest and Ian Bertram. Ian Bertram being my discovery of the year so far. Die by Kieron Gillen and Stephanie Hans. A thing that I'm definitely going to look at the second chapter of. Chip Zdarsky's Public Domain. Surprising and very entertaining. Not at all what I was expecting, but something whose second chapter I'm definitely going to seek out. Next up for my reading is the New York trilogy. If this gets really heavy, I also have a new volume of Invincible that has recently come in, so maybe I can switch back and forth between Karasik and the guys of Invincible. She and Her Cat, another surprising discovery. Quite a charming and an affecting read for me. Asadora, great fun. Not what I was expecting, but at the same time, very, very Urasawa in many ways. Looking forward to volume 2 and 7 more after that, apparently. And of course, Joe Sacco's The Once and Future Riot, probably going to make my top 5 reads of the year with no problem at all, unless some ridiculous competition comes up. A magnificent book that I highly recommend to everyone. So there we have it, a smallish group of titles for this live stream, but I've been out of the game for a while, so easing myself in, not straining any muscles by taking on 30-40 titles in a 4-hour live stream like we did for our Eisner games, but more of those to follow in 2026. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this live stream. I hope you enjoyed this quick look at these things, and keep your eyes out for more live streams, hopefully a couple of edited videos to follow soon, as well as my notices on the collaborations that I'm looking forward to doing more of on this channel and on other channels in this year. Happy New Year, everyone. This has been For the Love of Comics, and